So the topic of this afternoon is about resource politics. I'm not going to go with an attempt of coming up with a clear definition of what we entail by resource politics, but in some ways I'm using this picture perhaps as a starting point of this blue and green earth in some ways, these sort of harmonious colors. And in some ways resource politics perhaps would integrate a bit more red around these colors to reflect some of the sort of conflict, violence, and key trends and processes that are occurring. Obviously, there's really many different ways to understand and approach resource politics, and what we'll do today is just reflect, as part of our own sort of disciplinary background, but trying to go beyond our own disciplinary background, our own understanding and position with respect to the debates. But you could understand it from a political ecology perspective, from STS, anthropology, geography or critical political geography, development studies, and the list could be so much longer. There's so many takes on these issues. There's also another sort of recurring debate, which is also about this idea of, is it about resources or natural resources politics in some ways, and there the debate is whether in some ways natural resources is too much of a sort of constraint in the way of viewing these interactions. Whether natural resources, again, just focuses on one aspect of a relationship between human ecology interaction in some ways. And that's why we opt for a sort of broader understanding of resources that also includes sort of financial dimensions and so on. In some ways, there's also a different sort of standing point and perspective of how to approach the problem. In some ways, whether you start from very much from a sort of grounded approach, talking about the materiality of the resources, or you could start from a different perspective, essentially around how knowledge is constituted and formed, and how discourse are created. In some ways, what we're doing this morning through this sort of group exercise, we're very much starting from the second strand, but in some ways you can start also from the materiality of the resources and how sort of conflict and contestation on the ground are in some ways debated. But I guess the approach we'll try to develop today is to think of resource politics from a longer term perspective. And I think this morning already came out how one needs a sort of much longer term perspective to understand the dynamics of policy process, how discourse are being reproduced and replicated. And in some ways what we want to do in this session is an illustration of how resource politics need to be understood through a sort of long-term strategy of enclosure, territorialization and primitive accumulation. And in some ways, how we structured the talk is as follows. In the first part, I'm going to cover, in some ways, how can we rethink resource politics around the lens of violence, conflict, and security. Then Amber is going to talk very much about aspects related to abstraction, commodification, and financialization of nature. All great words to pronounce when you're a French speaker. Thanks, Amber. and then, in some ways, Lila will finish by regrouping these through one key example and thinking of whether we're reaching a sort of critical moment or not around questions of land, green, and water grabs. So that's basically the sort of structure of our presentation. In some ways, I wanted to start with, in doing my talk, I've been inspired by a number of readings, and that's my first go and my first attempt at doing, of looking at it through this sort of violence security perspective. And I got inspired by a number of readings from here. It's from Latour, that's talking about Anthropocene politics and war and conflict in the age of the Anthropocene, to other authors like critical geographers like Simon Dalby and so on, to anthropologists like Peluso and so on. So I try to bring really different perspectives into the debate. And I wanted to start with this one because in some ways I think it summarized quite neatly also some of the discussion in terms of sort of positionality, in terms of, how to be both at the same time a researcher or an activist or a researcher or involved in policy process. He comes up with this question, which is in his articles, are we or are we not living at the time of the Anthropocene? And in some ways he argues that some people that position themselves in the Anthropocene start thinking them as sort of earthbound in the Anthropocene, while those that are still thinking of them in the Holocene still think of them as humans. And what he tries to do with his article is really to sort of politicize debates around this, emphasizing obviously that sort of ecology has suffered from this lack rather than this excess of politicization. And he comes up with this idea that in some ways you have to position yourself at one end of the debate. And in some ways, I think it's quite an illustration of how resource politics can be approached. And he uses very much the language and the metaphors of war and conflicts. And he argues that, only those who have enemies do politics. Only those who are not treating their adversaries as irrational or mad or archaic may begin to equip themselves to win a battle. Sides have to be taken. And in some ways that summarizes very much what I believe one has to do in approaching the topic of resource politics. So let me turn to sort of particular lens, and that's just one lens, let me just emphasize this, of thinking of resource politics through violence. And I think this one is deeply problematic in the sense that the debates have very been much narrowed down to a sort of environmental security perspective. There are many problems with this category. The first one is obviously that again and again the link between sort of environment, security and violence is very much narrowed down to issues around scarcity. Very much limited to those that are aware of these debates around greed and grievances or natural resource curse. But the problem, obviously, is that, as one can see from many of these studies, it's not because of resource shortage or resource abundance that this leads to conflict by itself. I took a graph there, I don't know if you can see it, but just a graph that in some ways just represents how influential this thinking is, which is the early work that you are probably aware of Homer Dixon, which was basically trying to think of the relationship between resource scarcity and the social effects, especially in terms of conflict, from ethnic conflicts to deprivation conflicts. And this thinking has been so much imbued in a way that one thinks of resource politics and violence that what I want to do today is to try and propose a much broader perspective and understanding of the logics of violence in terms of resource politics. And I think in some ways that's just one illustration. My background, for some of you that may know me, is essentially water, and each time I say to people that work on water, they say, oh, how fantastic, but you'll be studying the next water wars of the next century. These kind of images are just stuck in the people's mind, and that's the first thing that comes to their mind. And as I said, I think it can be really traced back to these ideas of scarcity and their relationship with conflict. That, this little picture obviously represents the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Grand Renaissance dams. And again, the spectres of water wars are coming again. But in some ways, as we can see, there's never been really sort of water wars if defined around transboundary issues and transboundary water conflicts. What you can see is essentially the creation of intents but it has never been followed by military action. That's basically a word cloud that I took from The Economist. They've got a sort of a page that's specifically focusing on water. I just basically put all the text together, and that's the sort of word cloud that it produced. Again, that's another illustration of the sort of pessimistic view that one associated with particular resources. So you got, again, interestingly, scarcity doesn't come out, but you got notions of crisis, you got notions of droughts, you got a very negative understanding that comes out. There were images, of course, on the website that I've used. There I used them selectively. It's not a representation of all the images. But, you know, when the association of water with disastrous event is obviously repeated through different types of pictures, whether through the use of graphs or sort of dramatic pictures, or even messages. I think that's in Australia, where you can see this message that says, serious drought helped save water. So you got these association. But in some ways, what I want to emphasize in my talk today is that the resource politics and violence is very much blind to the sort of everyday structural violences or conflict stemming from state and economic forces. So it's not just about this narrow understanding of scarcity and conflict, but it's very much understanding it from a much broader historical perspective, thinking of, you know, on the first hand, on the reshaping of territories, nation-state building. For example, I did my PhD on what I term water nationalism, which was looking at how nation-making and state-building processes impacted on how transboundary water resources were shared. So, you know, even going back to our geographical textbook, how we think of our rivers as part of our identity and ourselves. So, in some ways, you can have a much deeper historical understanding of these sort of processes of territorialization. And obviously, these are built into much broader process of international political economy and of the expansion of sort of national integration into international markets. Another way, of course, to look at it is this notion of sort of empires, which is a sort of old notion, sort of in some ways coming back. So metropolitan cities, you know, from London to New York, rather than thinking of the UK, or thinking rather of these cities and the way they are having an impact on the sort of new frontiers of the sort of global economy. So in some ways, what's quite interesting is to look at it at whether we are reaching again a sort of turning point. Obviously, as you can see from the nature of my talk, I'm emphasizing much more sort of long-term continuity rather than a particular shift or a particular shock in the system that would transform it. But in some ways, the sort of framing of global security linked to particular resources has particularly evolved. Of course, oil has been a sort of security concern, you know, since the 70s, with the different oil shock and how, you know, oil became part of the sort of new geopolitics, to reaching different levels of global security, now talking very much about Anthropocene and climate security, and also sort of migration challenges. These were highlighted in the 2004 high-level panel on threat, challenges, and change. And in some ways, I've picked up this statement, I forgot from which one of my reading, although people that are quite critical, but that are in some ways reflecting on how we are reaching another stage and how humans are affecting the capacity of the Earth system and transformation that ensures. And I think my point on this is that one has to be really careful about the sort of security implication of these sort of perceived environmental disruptions. There's been many debates over the summer school over, you know, what are tipping points, what are the range of these tipping points, and so on. And obviously, one has to put in context and in some ways, engage with the debate and refrain from an agenda of danger and a mapping of fear. And really you think in some ways of rather than thinking of the sort of resources per se, also their interaction with sort of industrial and economic process linked to sort of urbanity and so on. There are other types of crisis. There's the famous word of John Beddington, who was the former scientific advisor to the UK government, who termed it the sort of perfect storm. Basically, the interaction between multiple interconnected global crises, rather than thinking of them of just one crisis around climate change, another one around food scarcity. It's very much a relationship between all of these and the effects that these have, from climate change to energy to food to economic stability, leading rise to sort of policy concepts that one can discuss a bit later around the nexus and so on. Also, there's other dynamics obviously linked to the sort of new green economy, and in some ways I think it's important, but Lila and Amber will go more in detail about this. To what extent these are new, and in some ways they're rebranding existing land struggles, but also generate new conflict because of the policy schemes that are put in place. And you've got other new frontiers obviously around carbon, around biofuels and so on, that are creating these cycles of conflict and violence. So in some ways, as you can see from my talk, what I'm trying to do is sort of historicize the relationship between resources, conflict and violence, ranging back, if you like, to the sort of pre-existing sort of colonial violence. And think of violence around sort of the process of enclosure. There's been a lot of talk around this idea of land frontiers. You just have to study the history of the US or Australia and so on, and these ideas of land frontiers and how the state expanded against a particular so-called indigenous people in these states. But it's much broader than this. Obviously, you can talk about forest, and that's the work of Peluso and Van der Gaast around this notion of political forest, but more largely around this idea of environmental territories, how you got a transformation of these territories and how they get territorialized. Forest, national parks, and protected areas, and so on. Just to give you a few examples. And in some ways, as I said, you got different lenses. I'm not pretending of giving a specific periodization, because these different lenses, from state terrorization to sort of empires to the new geopolitics of the Anthropocene, are all happening as sort of parallel processes. So don't read a chronology in what I'm presenting here. But in some ways, I've talked about sort of state territorialization and securitization in some ways. So the larger process of integrating the sort of rural people into sort of national politics and economic structures. Peluso, in her article essentially on forest, argues that it's very similar to sort of counter-insurgency techniques. So break up villages, isolation, and integrate villages into state politics and economy. James Scott also refers to transformation of just the political categories of forests, where nature are transformed into natural resources. And in some ways, you can go back to the sort of origin of the terminology to see this kind of transformation, basically in order to sort of secure state revenues and development. That's one lens. So I just picked up a quote from Peluso and Van der Gaast, basically argues that the ideologies and institutional practices associated with the conservation area of romantic notions of preserving rainforest, primary forest, and pristine forest were both preceded and enabled by this earlier violent period by which the jungles are made into primary forest or divided between political first and agriculture. Another one is very much linked to this idea of I picked this idea of Simon Dalby that came up with global, impossible to pronounce, globalization, I guess, globalization. But anyway, and empires, which is much more about seeing how sort of imperial centers and the relationship between sort of centers and periphery around an empire, and the sort of consequences of industrial production, resulting in obviously appropriation and displacement. The last one, which is essentially around the sort of geopolitics of the Anthropocene, I think comes up with a number of challenges for us as thinkers, and also particularly as I've put social scientists, but not just limited to these categories. In some ways, us as sort of urban residents. And I think it's quite interesting. I mean, we've been quite critical of the sort of Anthropocene, but it challenges this very old assumption that has been challenged again. But I think it's quite an important one of this notion of untouched and unpolluted nature as the basis for sort of environmental ethics. And I think what's interesting is that it goes beyond the sort of very narrow resource politics also of what we could call a cartography of resource conflicts. So just placing a map and just placing all and just thinking of the relationship and rivalries between different actors around this particular resource, rather than linking it through a larger system and view in some ways. In some ways, what are the different forms of resource violence? And I think that what's quite interesting is that you've got a sort of process of militarization that is very much occurring with some of these, where you can see the sort of privatization of security that happens at the same time through the use of private armies and security forces. You got two good examples. The first one is around sort of resource extraction enclaves, and sort of James Ferguson work on sort of enclave and seeing like an oil company. Quite interesting of how the idea of enclaves and the sort of militarization that goes with it. But the same is true, obviously, of sort of resource conservation. You got work by sort of Rosalind Duffy and many others that shows how sort of conservation becomes militarized with sort of forestry officers and sort of anti-poaching and so on. So you got this sort of larger processes occurring. And it's important to place this larger historical perspective, because otherwise you take these concepts like new concept like the nexus as just a form of sort of apolitical concepts, as just a form of greater integration there's nothing wrong with the concept in itself if you look at it that calls for greater integration behind this. But what's the reality of around nexus, and what are the implications of these kind of approaches? So in some ways, this, and it's a nice link with Amber, does the growing marketization of water, food, energy and climate help to enhance local well-being and rights? Or again, are these processes allowing new actors to increase processes of enclosure and common? So that's, in some ways, if you put some of these key concepts within a historical perspective, you can bring back these kinds of debate rather than a very narrow understanding of resource politics and violence.